Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture, section 1.5, the Commercial Revolution. This is our last lecture in Unit 1. The objective and themes for today's lecture are as follows. The objectives. First, you will need to be able to explain European commercial and agricultural developments and their economic effects from 1450 to 1648. And you will also need to be able to explain European commercial and agricultural developments and their social effects from 1450 to 1648. So, economic and social developments are often closely intertwined and really kind of represent a cause and effect relationship. So, really, what we're trying to do here is to identify both economic and social effects of the commercial revolution. And so our themes today, not surprisingly, are economic and commercial developments and social organization and development. So let's first start with this idea of the growth of commercial capitalism. So the commercial revolution, in its most basic definition, is developments in banking and finance from about 1500 to 1800. And this is really sort of the major economic development of the early modern period. The commercial revolution included new systems of bookkeeping, banking, merchandising, and investment. And it also led to the development of economic systems like capitalism and mercantilism, which we'll talk about both of those in today's lecture. It also included the emergence of new industries such as textile industries, mining, printing, the new book trade, shipbuilding, weapon production, and many others, and also the expansion of new consumer goods or popular goods like sugar, rice, and tea, which collectively stimulated economic activity in Europe. So when we look at the major causes of the commercial revolution, we can see that it really has its roots in medieval trade, right? Thinking back to the resurgence of long distance trade during the High Middle Ages. Population growth is also another major cause. The price revolution, which is a topic we'll cover later in the lecture. States and emerging empires, right? Those new states and their emerging colonial empires that wanted to increase their economic power, and also a rise in capitalism, which is basically business entrepreneurs investing money in business ventures. Again, we'll talk about that more later. But those causes, again, are medieval trade, population growth, the price revolution, states and their emerging colonial empires, and a rise in capitalism. Now, some of the most important developments in the early commercial revolution are in banking. We've already learned about the Medici in Italy and how they were one of the leading bankers in Europe, but there was also another prominent banking family in Germany. They were called the Fuggers, Fuggers, the Fuggers. So the Medici and the Fuggers had these large, almost multinational banks run by these families. And while Italy had initially been the banking center in the late medieval and early modern period, we will actually see the commercial center of Europe shift from Italy to the Netherlands and what is modern day Belgium. Specifically, a city known as Antwerp, Antwerp, in the region of Flanders. This became the banking and commercial center of Europe in the 16th century. And then ultimately, Amsterdam in the Netherlands would become the banking center of Europe by the 17th century. And by that point, banks began appearing in all major European cities across the continent. Another characteristic of the commercial revolution is the emergence of the first stock markets, such as the Bourse in Antwerp. Stock markets sort of worked like this. Investors would finance a company by purchasing shares of stock or shares of a company. And as the value of the company grew, so did the value of the stock and thus the investor's profit. And they could buy and sell and trade stock for various companies. So, the overall significance of the commercial revolution is that it was a slow transition from a European society that was almost completely rural and isolated, like we would see in the Middle Ages, to a society that was more developed with the emergence of towns. It was a very gradual process over several centuries. Now, with the commercial revolution, we also see the rise of chartered companies. These chartered companies were essentially big, almost monopolies or corporations that were state supported and generally monopolized and controlled areas of trade. Examples of this would be the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, and there was also a British West India Company and a Dutch West India Company. These chartered companies became, in effect, almost like a state within a state, as they had their own large fleets of ships and their own military power. And they often managed multiple industries. So, beyond trade, they also managed a shipbuilding industry, investment industries, and other types of businesses. In many ways, these chartered companies are the forerunners to international mega corporations of the 20th century. And these companies could also be incredibly wealthy. Just ridiculously wealthy. For example, at its height in the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company was worth approximately $7.9 trillion. All right, so here is an example of what that would look like. Okay, so on the left side, you can see that represents the value of the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. And on the right, you can see what the equivalent of that would be for 20 modern companies, right? So all the net worth of all those companies, and this graphic is maybe a few years old, but you get the general idea. The worth of all these companies would be equal to the worth of the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. Let's also talk a little bit about the development of capitalism. So this is an important definition. Make sure you're able to write it down. Capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of property and businesses to produce goods to be bought and sold in a free market. And I will repeat that at least one more time. An economic system based on the private ownership of property and businesses to produce goods to be bought and sold in a free market. And that idea of private businesses and private ownership of property and also the free market are really the key factors here. Now, the prices in this free market were managed by a quote, invisible hand, meaning they were determined, these prices were managed by the laws of supply and demand. And this was supported by institutions organized to promote the accumulation of wealth. So institutions such as banks and insurance companies, and also joint stock companies, which are basically big businesses. And as capitalism begins to emerge in the early modern era, we will see that it will phase out and replace the guild system of the Middle Ages, which tended to advocate for a lot more interference in the economy, whereas capitalism supports a free market. Our last point here is about the creation of joint stock companies. Joint stock companies, think of these as like big businesses, but not necessarily quite as big as those chartered companies like the British East India or the Dutch East India Company. In a joint stock company, individuals bought shares in the company and received dividends or payments on their investment, while a board of directors ran the company and made important business decisions. Again, this is basically the model of most modern day corporations. And for those investors, the returns on certain investments could be enormous, right? They could be very, very profitable. And joint stock companies made it easier to raise large amounts of capital for these various world trading ventures we see during the age of exploration and colonization. And ultimately, it minimized the risk of investment for many people. So instead of one person or simply the state sponsoring the entire cost of a voyage, this is almost like many people pooling their money together to support the cost of a voyage. And let's say you bought you paid for 5% of the cost. That means if this voyage returns and it's successful, you get 5% of the profit. And that's how these dividend payments could be very, very profitable. So joint stock companies were most common in England and the Netherlands, which tend to be our more capitalistic countries. These were states that were more supportive of the rule of law and the use of contracts, which was not as common in, say, France and Spain, which had absolutist governments and were more inclined to have their government control the economy and business. And then we'll learn that that's more of the practice of mercantilism as an economic system, which we're going to talk about in a moment here. But first, I did want to show you this graphic because I think it's really useful for understanding how the age of exploration leads to the commercial revolution and what the major effects are, right? So the age of exploration leads to increased world trade, which creates a demand for workers. It also leads to more cash, more banking, and more lending services. It allows merchant class to expand its wealth and power. And you can see those can lead to other effects like serfs and peasants moving to towns and workers being paid for labor. More money is available for building businesses, and the taxes of the new merchant class help to increase the king's power and wealth, which of course ties into a lot of the political themes of the new monarchies. So again, I think this is a really useful graphic for sort of understanding some of the basic cause and effect of how we get from the age of exploration to the commercial revolution, which of course affects society and politics and economics in many, many different ways. So let's talk about mercantilism, which is an important economic theory of the early modern era. This was really the dominant economic system for governments in the 16th and 17th century. And the basic premise of mercantilism is that your prosperity or wealth of the country was dependent on bullion. And bullion specifically refers to gold and silver. So the underlying premise here, if we're going to make it even simpler, is that wealth equals power. And ultimately, protection of the nation's economy is the main goal. They wanted nations, someone's individual nation like France or Spain, to have a self-sufficient economy. And it was the responsibility of the government to promote and to protect the state's economy. And one of the ways to do that is to maximize the amount of gold and silver that the economy possessed, right, within that country. And so ideally, you would want, when you're engaging in trade, you would want other countries to promote gold and silver payments towards you. Like, so you sell them stuff and they buy it using gold and silver, and that would increase the quantity of wealth within the country. So mercantilism is defined by the following characteristics as well: the hoarding of precious metals, of bullion, by protectionist trade policies, lots of colonial development, and to support that, of course, we have shipbuilding, trade, and manufacturing. One of the ways this favorable balance of trade was achieved was by establishing high tariffs on imported goods from other countries. A tariff, T-A-R-I-F-F, is essentially a tax on imported goods, right? And so this was a way to limit imports, limit what your country was buying from others. Because ultimately, for a favorable balance of trade, a country would want their exports, what they're selling, to be greater than the imports, which is what they're buying, right? So the favorable balance of trade had goods exported that were greater value than those imported. And a way this was supported was through the development of colonies. So countries, mercantilist countries, would develop colonies for raw materials, and also these colonies became new markets for finished goods. And these colonies would usually only be allowed to trade with their mother country, meaning Spanish colonies could only trade with Spain, and British colonies could only trade with Britain. And underlying all of this is the premise that the value of the goods is more important than the volume of the goods. So, again, another sort of underlying principle of mercantilism is that state intervention in the economy is a good thing, right? That's what mercantilism supports, is state intervention in the economy. But even though mercantilism implied more government control than capitalism, both emphasized the advantages of allowing individuals to develop their own business initiatives. So capitalism can still work within mercantilism, and ultimately the goals of both economic systems are the same, which is the accumulation of wealth. But mercantilism became the dominant economic system for many absolute monarchies, like in France and Spain, because those absolute monarchies already had so much state control over the national economy. We will see some mercantilist practices from constitutional countries like England and the Netherlands. Okay, these are things not mutually exclusive. Like you can have capitalism and mercantilism coexisting to an extent. But we tend to see more mercantilism from absolutist countries and a little bit more capitalism from the constitutional countries. Okay, moving on now to some of those economic effects of the commercial and agricultural developments. This will definitely help you with your write-up, I will think. So one important continuity, economic continuity, is the agricultural economy. All right, and this is something that is a strong continuity all throughout the Middle Ages and basically into the modern era until about the 19th century when we get to the Industrial Revolution. So with this continuity, it means that most Europeans derived their livelihood from agriculture and oriented their lives around the seasons. For most of the early modern period, peasants were still managing subsistence agriculture. And subsistence agriculture means they were only able to produce enough to just barely get by. And this is largely due to the agricultural system they were using at the time, which was called the three-field system, which limited the volume and the productivity of the crops that were produced. This also means that the village or the manor was still the primary center of social, political, and economic life for many, many people in Europe. However, the one change in this situation is that these farmers were no longer serfs, right? They were no longer constrained by the bonds of serfdom, at least in Western Europe. They were now just regular peasants who often paid rent and provided labor services for the lands. Some peasants might own their own lands, and some peasants might still kind of be renters who worked the land of larger, wealthier landowners, kind of like they did as serfs, but without the same level of control. Now, another very important economic effect is something we call the price revolution. I can guarantee you're going to get questions about the price revolution in future exams. Now, the primary cause of the price revolution was population growth. So basically, as the population started to grow in the 16th century, it led to more consumers, like more people needing to buy and consume goods. So that means there's a greater demand. And as we know from the basic laws of supply and demand, an increased demand often means an increased price, right? So prices then gradually rose on many popular consumer products throughout the 16th century due to this increased demand. Another contributing factor was the influx of gold and silver from the New World, but this was not the major factor. The major factor was still population growth. That's like the primary cause, and the influx of gold and silver can be the secondary cause, because this price revolution is ultimately inflation, right? Inflation would stimulate production as producers could get more and more money for their goods. Um, and a group that specifically benefited from this was the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie, think of them as sort of like the upper middle class, the merchant class sometimes. So they usually lived in urban areas. But this group, the bourgeoisie, and I'm going to spell it for you because it's a French, so it's tricky. Bourgeoisie is spelled Bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie. This group acquired much of their wealth from trading and manufacturing, and of course, with increased wealth, this meant that their social and political status also increased. Peasant farmers could even benefit in this situation when their crops provided a surplus, meaning they had extra stuff to sell, and that surplus could be turned into sort of some cash crops that they could sell and profit from. However, the nobility, the traditional nobility, whose income was often fixed because it was based on feudal rents and fees from peasants, sometimes suffered a diminished standard of living in this inflationary economy. I mean, we're not talking like they go from nobles to peasants, but the inflation benefited the bourgeoisie. It could benefit some landowning peasants, but it usually did not benefit the nobility. And one of the last economic effects that I want to touch upon is something called the commercialization of agriculture in Western Europe. Now, this is not really going to be a development we see until like the 18th century. So there's a lot more stuff for us to talk about between now and then. But this is an important precursor to the Industrial Revolution, which is the other major change, major turning point in the course that we'll talk about probably the beginning of second semester. Right, but the commercialization of agriculture basically is the incorporation of new agricultural techniques and agricultural technologies to increase the amount of food being produced. And the overall effect of this is that of the commercialization of agriculture is that wage earners like peasants often suffered, but landowners would prosper, right? And we're going to talk more about the commercialization of agriculture in later units, but that is overall an economic effect of this commercial revolution. All right, we are on our last slide now, which is the social effects of commercial and agricultural developments. So one of the most important social effects is this new group of economic elites. So beyond the nobility, we now see a privileged ruling group, a ruling class, sort of an upper class emerging, that we can call either the gentry or the bourgeoisie. Gentry refers to people who generally owned land without a title, but who were not necessarily at peasant status. These could be wealthy, comfortable landowners who owned a lot of land but didn't have the fancy title to go with it. And the bourgeoisie were basically wealthy urban dwellers, think middle class or upper middle class. And they usually both these groups increased in their political and economic significance over the first few centuries of the modern era. And this also shows us that education and wealth became the means for moving up the social ladder, but this was also still an opportunity limited to a fortunate few. Overall, there still was very little social mobility for the vast majority of Europe. But this does allow for a class of wealthy, educated, and socially ambitious families to emerge in both urban and rural areas. We saw this with the growth of the merchant class in Italy, and also merchants and businessmen in the Netherlands, and even a group of new nobility in France that are referred to as the nobles of the robe. Some of these people, members of the bourgeoisie and gentry, were even able to buy titles of nobility for themselves, or they might receive titles as gifts from the monarchy for their service in government offices, which means that many members of this new economic elite would come to dominate city governments. Right, so wealth and education allowed them to acquire positions of power in city governments and national governments. And this also was one of the things that would gradually replace the dominance of guilds from the Middle Ages, because guilds tended to have a lot of political and economic power in towns. But guilds are going to be on the decline now with the commercial revolution. They're no longer compatible with a lot of the new developments that we're seeing. Also, the commercial revolution allowed for an increased standard of living among these upper and middle classes, right? This new economic elite. But even though it seems like this is a significant change, and it is, we have to remember that European society was still rigidly hierarchical and lacked social mobility for the vast majority of the population. The vast majority of the population continued to be peasants working in agriculture, both in Western and Eastern Europe. However, there are some notable differences that are starting to emerge for the life of peasants in Western and Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, we are actually starting to move away from serfdom and manorialism in the early modern era. And the commercial revolution was advantageous to the middle class and the upper class, as well as maybe some of these land-owning peasants. Peasants still constituted the largest percentage of the rural population. Some owned land, and most were still basing their lives on subsistence agriculture. And also in Western Europe, peasants were usually considered to be free people. They could still have some obligations if they worked on the land of a landlord. We would call them tenant farmers. But still, they could migrate, they could marry, they could learn trades. They did not have many of those restrictions we would see with serfdom. And this does mean that there was some opportunity for upward economic mobility for some peasants, but this was still few and far between, and it usually involved peasants moving from the countryside into rural areas. But again, the vast majority were still working in subsistence agriculture in the countryside. And this still meant that there were pockets of poverty and just very low standard of living, especially for landless workers. So people who did not own land but worked on other land often owned the lowest wages and had the lowest standard of living. However, in Eastern Europe, a different story starts to emerge. Whereas serfdom and manorialism declined in Western Europe at the start of the modern era, it actually increased in Eastern Europe. So again, serfdom and manorialism declines in Western Europe, but it increases in Eastern Europe. And this meant as well that only the nobility of Eastern Europe benefited from the commercial revolution. In fact, the commercial revolution led to the expansion of serfdom and land holdings in order to meet the demands of this new market economy. For example, there was an increased demand in grain in Eastern Europe to sell to Western Europe and its growing population. So this encouraged the landlords of Eastern Europe to tighten their controls over the peasants, making them serfs in these in the agriculture. Eastern Europe also saw much slower economic development, and the vast majority of the population was illiterate and poor. There were also many attempts by landlords, by the nobility, to increase their own personal revenue by restricting or abolishing the traditional rights of peasants. And this could sometimes lead to revolts and rebellions. One example of this that we will see is an event called the German Peasants' War, which took place in the Holy Roman Empire in 1524 through 1525, and that will also have significant connections to the Reformation, and so we'll explore that more in Unit 2. Another important social effect are the changes we see with women, marriage, and the family. Now, in the early 17th century, that's the early 1600s, there was a general cooling of the planet temperatures and several years of bad weather that historians generally refer to as the Little Ice Age. So the combination of the Little Ice Age, which was several years of very bad weather, which affected agriculture, and also some economic troubles, this encouraged many families to try and limit the number of children that they had. Not that any type of effective birth control was available, but it still encouraged parents to try to limit the children that they had. Ways they were able to do this was often to marry at a later age. So if they married in their later 20s versus their earlier 20s, they would have fewer children. But still, the average was usually 4 children per family. And there were also still very high infant mortality rates because of the lack of health care, and also childbirth was the leading cause of death for women in this period. Now, this European marriage pattern, specifically for Western Europe, continued for a few centuries. And it was one of the ways to limit some population growth and also improve the economic condition of individual families. If the family has fewer children, it's fewer mouths to feed and less of an economic burden. Society was still very patriarchal. That's a continuity we can identify. And education and employment opportunities remained limited, very limited, for most women. And finally, a significant social effect is the gradual growth of cities and urban areas. And I want to emphasize again the word gradual. But improved economic conditions from the commercial revolution encouraged urbanization and the gradual migration to cities and towns. In these cities and towns, we would often see that merchants, or the bourgeoisie, were among the wealthiest and most powerful members of these urban communities. But also, migrants to the cities could challenge the ability of these merchant elites and the traditional medieval craft guilds to govern, and it also could put a greater strain on the resources of the city, right? More people means more demand for goods, more resources are necessary. Also, some of these early modern cities saw problems with sanitation caused by overpopulation, as there was no plumbing or sort of hygiene like that. Also, very limited employment opportunities, increased poverty, and increased crime were other common problems of urban areas. And this also was very difficult for the traditional craftsmen and laborers who worked out of the guild system of the Middle Ages, as fewer positions became available and competition among craftsmen and laborers increased. However, even though we are starting to see the gradual growth of cities in the 16th and 17th and even 18th centuries, I still want to emphasize that the vast majority of the European population are still peasants working in agriculture in the countryside. We will not see the demographic shift to having larger cities until we get to the Industrial Revolution, and that will be well into the 19th century. But that brings us to the end of our last Unit 1 lecture. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to do your write-up and enjoy the rest of your day.